You know, there's a kind of silence you only really notice when something is fundamentally wrong. Take a second to really think about that. We are not talking about the peaceful kind of silence here. Not the quiet of a house where everyone is just safely, comfortably asleep. No, we're talking about a silence that feels heavy, the kind of absolute stillness that makes it feel like the house itself is holding its breath.
The Night Villisca Went Silent, a 1912 mystery.
Welcome to This Explainer on one of the most chilling, genuinely baffling unsolved mysteries in American history. Now, this isn't just a story about a crime. It's really a look at the terrifying void left behind when an entire family is just erased without making a single sound. To understand why this case still gets on our skin today, we have to establish the baseline. The date is June 9th, 1912. The place is Villisca, Iowa, and this was a town where people literally did not lock their doors. Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 kids, and 2 young neighborhood girls who were just over for a sleepover were settling in after what was a completely, perfectly ordinary Sunday. They'd gone to church in the evening, chatted politely with neighbors, the kids were wrapping up their day. There was absolutely zero tension in the air. Honestly, if you had stopped anyone on the street that night and asked if anything felt off, they would have looked at you like you were crazy. The house simply went to sleep.
And that peaceful Sunday night sets up the absolute core of this mystery, the unsettling gap. Sometime after the town fell quiet around 10 p.m. and before 7 a.m. the next morning, the timeline just completely breaks down. We know an intruder entered the Moore house. There were no signs of forced entry at all, so no broken glass, no shattered locks. They just walked right in. But what investigators later realized, and this is the part that really haunts you, is that whoever this was, they didn't rush. They waited. They waited long enough for that house to be completely, totally still. By mid-morning, the Moores' usual early morning routine of chores and getting the day started was noticeably entirely absent.
It was that bizarre absence that actually triggered the discovery. An elderly neighbor, noticing that nothing was moving over at the Moore place, walked over and knocked. No answer. So she tried the door. Remember, it was unlocked. But stepping inside, she immediately felt that the air was just interrupted. It wasn't that she walked right into a gruesome scene, it was what she didn't hear. There were no voices, no footsteps. It was just a house that felt entirely paused.
She called out their names, and still nothing. Eventually, someone else was called over to go check upstairs, and the reaction of that person is what makes this so incredibly chilling. Within seconds of going up there, they came right back down. But they didn't scream. Actually, scratch that. They didn't even run out in a blind panic. They just came downstairs, completely drained of color, and very quietly said, "Get the sheriff."
Section 1. The Controlled Silence. Inside the Moore house.
When the sheriff finally stepped into that home, the whole tone of the investigation shifted on a dime, because what he found defied all basic human instinct. There was absolutely no chaos, no spreading struggle. There was zero sign of a fight that moved from room to room or down the stairs. The beds showed signs that everyone had gone to sleep entirely normally. Whatever happened that night started while everyone was fast asleep, and incredibly, it stayed fully contained to those exact rooms. Not a single sound of panic echoed through those hallways.
And containing a situation like that requires a methodical, terrifying routine. The intruder deliberately drew the curtains tight, completely shutting out the morning light. They carefully took clothing and covered specific mirrors inside the home. Down in the kitchen, the plates and the food were totally undisturbed, but certain small objects were just quietly repositioned. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, just intentionally moved. The killer actually spent time shaping the environment, just lingering in the space alongside the unspeakable scene they had just created, feeling absolutely no urgency to leave.
Eight victims, 6 members of the Moore family, and their 2 young guests. 8 people were left in that house while the intruder just calmly remained inside, totally undisturbed. They didn't just commit this horrible act and flee into the night, they chose to stay right there in the suffocating silence they had just engineered. So it all really boils down to one word: composure. The ability to move through a quiet space without triggering chaos under immense pressure. I mean, even on old, creaky wooden floors, even with 8 people in a relatively small house, this unseen intruder moved with such terrifying, absolute control that not a single neighbor next door heard a shout, a crash, or even a whisper.
Section 2. Theories and Unanswered Questions. Weighing the Suspects.
By that afternoon, the Moore house became the focal point of the entire region.
Outside investigators started arriving, bringing in patterns and motives they had seen in other places. But Villisca just didn't fit cleanly into any of them. Almost overnight, the town completely stopped trusting itself. Law enforcement was essentially trapped between two massive paradoxes. The first theory was the familiar face. This suggested it was someone known to the family, right? Someone who understood their routines and the layout of the house. That would definitely explain the quiet confidence, but it carries a massive risk of recognition. And remember, there was zero signs of a confrontation. The second theory was the phantom drifter, basically an unknown transient just passing through town. Now, this explains why there were no clear links or motives left behind. But transient crimes are almost always quick, unplanned, and reactive. The crime in the Moore house was deeply structured.
Which brings investigators to the third, and honestly, the most terrifying theory: the experienced offender. It's the idea that whoever managed this unbelievable level of composure, whoever had the sheer patience to wait in the dark and the control to avoid mass panic, had done this before. You don't just figure out how to maintain that level of intense psychological control on your very first try. And if this was true, it meant Villisca wasn't just an isolated nightmare, it was part of a larger, hidden pattern.
But you have to remember, the tools to prove that kind of cross-state pattern simply didn't exist back then, which led to a rapidly collapsing investigation. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape. Suspect alibis would hold up solidly under some conditions and then totally fall apart under others. Witness memories naturally began to shift over the passing days, which injected this dangerous doubt into almost every single statement. Plus, in 1912, trying to connect records of similar crimes in other states was basically impossible. And ultimately, reconstructing exactly how that intruder moved through the house minute by minute proved to be completely impossible.
Yet through all the contradictions and dead ends, one unchanging fact remained, and it is arguably the single most disturbing detail of the entire explainer. No one saw anyone leave. Just think about that for a second. Slipping into an unlocked house in the pitch black dead of night, that's relatively easy to explain. But exiting, unseen, in a town that is actively waking up, with neighbors starting their morning chores right next door, that is almost physically impossible.
And that leads to a question that forces us to completely reevaluate the entire timeline. What if they stayed way longer than anyone realized? What if our basic assumption of cause and effect is just entirely wrong here? When we reconstruct these events, we naturally assume order. We assume the intruder did the deed and then immediately fled into the night. But what if they didn't follow a predictable logical path at all? What if they just stayed, waiting inside the house, moving the curtains and the objects, just existing in that heavy silence until the absolute perfect, unnoticed moment to simply walk right out the front door?
Section 3. A horror without an ending. The legacy of Villisca.
The investigation into the Moore house never truly closed. It just sort of slowed down. The immediate panic faded away, but those heavy, unresolved questions settled right into the foundation of the town itself. Because the true weight of Villisca isn't just in what happened that night, it's in what didn't happen. There was no clear entry point. There was no clear exit point. There was never a confirmed suspect. It was just an ordinary house that held a horrific, unspeakable event and then gave absolutely nothing back to the people desperately looking for answers.
Just who? And seriously, how did no one hear anything at all? In a creaky house packed with 8 people, in a tiny town where literally every sound carries in the still of the night, how did one single person move through that space and leave behind nothing but an echoing, permanent silence?
You know, some events terrify us because of the overwhelming visual evidence they leave behind. But Villisca stays with us because of the terrifying lack of it, which leaves us with this final, incredibly uncomfortable thought to walk away with. If something exactly like this could happen once, so precisely, so incredibly silently, without anyone noticing at all, how would anyone know if it ever happened again?